Elidor by Garner. 14. The High Places. Roland said nothing about the shadows. When the other children had come home, he had not the courage to go outside again. He realized, too, that nothing less than the shadows themselves would convince Nicholas, and the next morning and all Saturday there was no static change in the garden. "I wish you'd have a look at the front door, Frank," said Mrs. Watson at tea on Saturday. "It jutters every time a car goes past. It's the kind of noise that sets my teeth on edge. I could hardly sew this afternoon. It's become much worse lately." "Very good, dear," said Mr. Watson. "I'll see what can be done in the morning. It may need a touch of the screwdriver." "And I wish you had paid those boys the other night instead of preaching at them. They've been in and out of that porch all day. It's their way of getting their own back, I suppose." "I explained at the time that it was a matter of principle," said Mr. Watson. "But what have they done now?" "Oh, they've been dragging their feet, turning the doorknob, flapping the letterbox, that sort of thing." "Didn't you stop them?" said Mr. Watson. "They're much too quick. They're off and out of sight the moment they hear the curtain rings move. I gave it up after the second time. They'll soon tire of it when they see we're not to be drawn." "Or they'll be provoked to worse mischief," said Mr. Watson. "My mother was once nearly frightened to death when some louts dropped a rip-rap through her letterbox. It could have set the house on fire, too. Oh, no, we must put a firm stop to it." "Listen," said Nicholas, "they're at it again. Shall David and I nip out and clobber them?" "Certainly not," said Mr. Watson. "I mean to deal with this once and for all. I'm going to catch them from behind. You just go on talking normally." "Don't do anything silly, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. Mr. Watson let himself out by the back door. The children and their mother listened to the shuffling that was going on the porch. "Sounds as though there's quite a few of them," said David. "I wonder if Dad will be all right." "Don't be daft," said Nicholas. "That kid who was collecting was only 8 or 9. I still think we should clobber them. Dad'll lay the law down. But he won't do anything else, except ask their names and addresses. And who'd be mug enough to give him real ones?" The back door opened and Mr. Watson stamped in. "Too late," he said. "Not a soul in sight." "We heard them all the time you were out, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. "They've never stopped." "Are you sure you went?" "My dear Gwen," said Mr. Watson, "the street lamp across the road shines right onto the porch. They're hiding in gateways. I'm not playing their game for them." "They're not hiding, Frank. You didn't listen to what I said. They were in the porch all the time, and they are there now." "Eh? What? Good heavens!" The letterbox snapped shut. "But this is preposterous!" Mr. Watson was pale with indignation. "We'll soon deal with that, though. If I open the door when they're not expecting it, I'll trap them against the porch. Then we'll see who's being so funny." "No, Dad," said Roland. "Don't. Please don't." Mr. Watson frowned Roland to silence and put his hand on the catch, taking care not to move the brass rings of the curtain. The doorknob turned. Mr. Watson threw the door open. "Got you! Dad, no!" Roland tried to reach his father to pull him away, but he became entangled in the curtain. Mr. Watson was thrusting the door hard against the inside wall of the porch. "Now then," he said. "Now then." But as he eased the pressure, the heavy oak door scooped him off his feet and slammed him back into the room. The door crashed shut and Mr. Watson fell over, Roland tearing the curtain down on top of them both. Nicholas pushed forward. "No, don't go," said Mrs. Watson. There had been something brutal in the speed with which the door had moved. "Nick!" They dragged the curtain from Mr. Watson. He was sitting dazed on the floor, with one eye beginning to close. His nose was bleeding. "Hooligans," he said. "Arrogant hooligans." "You go looking for trouble," said Mrs. Watson when she bathed his eye. "For all you know, it could have been one of those teenage gangs after the overspill." "You said it was the carol singers." "I know I did, but it wasn't, was it? 8-year-olds wouldn't have done this, would they? Roland, come away from the window. You'll egg them on to something else if they're still hanging around. Ignore them, and they soon lose interest." Roland watched the poplar branches curling like tentacles round the street lamp. The road glistened, but he knew that when he had stood next to his father at the door, all beyond the porch had been in darkness, except for the glow of a log fire burning nearby. It was 3 in the morning when Roland went downstairs. Coals tinkled in the grate, and the clock raced with the double note that Roland never heard in daylight. The front door vibrated, although the only traffic was the long-distance lorries on the main road a quarter of a mile away. He knew that it was up to him to do something. After this, there would be more than curiosity. He listened at the curtain. He had switched off the pencil torch and clipped it to his pajama pocket. There was no sound of movement or breathing in the porch, and so Roland eased himself into the space between the curtain and the door. Still no sound apart from the quiet jarring of the wood. The air smelled of curtain, and a thin draft slipped round him. The coconut matting needled his feet. Roland braced himself on his toes and looked with one eye through a gap between the letterbox frame and its hinge. Now that the road was dark, Roland could see quite well in the shadow light of Elidor. It was nowhere that he recognized. In his narrow angle of vision, there was nothing but mountains, peaks, crags, ice, and black rocks stabbed upward. The porch seemed to be at the top of a cliff, or a knife-backed ridge. Roland had the sensation of a sheer drop behind him in the room. Down the mountainside, in front, lay a camp of tents, and there was a hunting party winding from it up a track that passed the door. The men rode stags and carried lances, and some had bows across their backs. Wolfhounds ran before them. Close to the porch, there was a bivouac in the shelter of a rock. Here the fire Roland had glimpsed burned pale and colorless, and next to it squatted a man holding a spear. A hound sniffed at the porch, but was called off sharply. The riders looked at the door as they went by. One of them spoke to the man at the fire, who was now standing. He shook his head and pointed with his spear down to the camp. At this moment, the door stopped vibrating and the scene vanished, and Roland was squinting out at his own night, and all he could hear was the lorries. He lowered his heels. The man had been a sentry, guarding the porch. They had found it. They knew it was a way through. They would come when they were ready. It's my fault, thought Roland. I made it. What can I do? The door buzzed again. He lifted himself up. Only a few seconds had passed. It must have been longer in Elidor. The fire was bigger, and there was a different sentry. The new man was walking up and down to keep warm. It must be freezing, thought Roland. And why do they need such a huge camp? They can't live up here all the time. There's nothing but rock and ice, thousands of feet high. A high place, high places. Who walks in the high places? Findhorn. That's it, the song of Findhorn. Maelbron was going to look. He said there were mountains. Then they're looking too. It was impossible that this could be Maelbron's camp. These men had his nobility, his bearing, his dress, but only Maelbron had that golden light about him. Their beauty was the beauty of steel, every line of them cut hard as an engraving. Oh, what can I do? Thought Roland. The sentry halted and stared at the letterbox as if he had heard Roland speak. Then he came toward the door. Roland slid down as far as he could. He heard the familiar footsteps on the porch, and a hand pushed the letterbox open. The knob was turned. The door moved against the lock, scuffle and silence. When Roland dared look, the sentry was bending over the fire and stirring food in a pot. It's all my fault. I made it. I made it. The answer stopped him. I must unmake it. Roland fixed his eyes on the porch. Go away. Disappear. Scram. Go on. The porch did not hear. Roland tried to will it away, to think of nothing, but he could not imagine nothing. It had no shape to build in his mind. He felt as weak as if he was pushing the bricks with his hands. The sentry was restless and kept walking over to the door. Think, Roland told himself. Think. How does a house fall? You don't just shove it over. The church. What happened first? It was the mortar between the bricks running out. That's it. Bricks can't stay up without mortar. He closed his eyes and pictured the arch in his mind. When it was fixed there, he concentrated on the joints of the brickwork. Gray mortar, loose, dry, crumbling. Oh, come on, come on. Roland heard a sound, a whisper like rain or leaves. He heard it again. A thin dust was settling on the porch. Come on, you porch. You're not all real. You're an echo, not all solid. Come on, you echo. The mortar grew to a trickle. He dared to open his eyes, and although the dust fall slackened, it did not stop. He forced his mind like a drill between the bricks of the porch in Elidor. The sentry yelled, but Roland broke his concentration only long enough to see that the man had noticed what was happening and was running back to the camp. Come on, Break! Come on! More! A brick fell, then another, and a crack went up in the roof. That's it! He picked at the gap, heaving, tearing. It was easier. The bricks dropped. If he could undermine the roof, the weight of the stone tiles would pull the whole thing down. But he was laboring now with the cutting edge of his mind dulled, and every stroke was taking more energy to drive home. Men were hurrying from the camp. He sobbed and groaned and hit unaimed blows at the porch with all his will. The men carried two-handed axes, and the first to reach the door swung his axe down into the wood. The house boomed like a drum. The axe was wrenched out, and up and down it smashed again. Roland gathered his energy and made one blind lunge. Everything of him poured out. And after that, there was nothing, and into this nothing the porch began to fall. A third time the axe struck, but the blade was muffled, and the fourth made no sound at all. The men shouted in silence, and the porch grew dim. Beyond the peaks of the mountains, two beams of yellow light flashed in the sky, and behind the sky was a bloom of darkness. The shadow of another porch covered the bricks, close as a skin, but whole where the arch was broken. The man with the axe hewed the door, yet could not touch it, and he jumped clear as the roof and the walls crashed toward him, and Elidor drowned in the headlights of a car that was turning off the main road. The twin yellow beams flickered through the poplar trees and glanced from the wall to the porch. Roland sagged against the door. The wood was like ice on his brow. And that is the end of chapter 14.